Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Lockdown Learning Free Business Continuity webinar from BC Training and Plan B Consulting. Today's webinar is on exercising to failure and will be presented by Andrew Atterbury, who is a senior consultant at Plan B Consulting, our sister company. We, as usual, will be having a short Q&A section at the end of the webinar. To submit your questions, all you need to do is type in the question box on the control panel to the right of your screen, and these will be put through to Andrew at the end of the session. We will do our best to get through as many questions as we can. You'll receive a recording of the webinar later on today in case you missed any of the session. So I think we're ready to begin, and I will hand you over to Andrew. Just give us a couple of seconds. Over to Andrew. Andrew, you should have control now. Do you want to just share your screen? Excellent. Right, I shall leave you to it.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. I was sort of thinking recently and thinking about why we exercise and what we're looking to achieve. And I suppose it's a continuation of Charlie's theme when he spoke about exercising recently. But how often when we complete an exercise do we walk away and think, well, I've ticked that box for the year, I've completed my exercise. How often do participants sort of come away with that feeling that they've given their day to BC for the year and that actually, you know, they've ticked that box and achieved what they want to do? And I suppose there's also the element of when we're doing our exercises, how often do we sit there at the end? We're looking at the time, we've done maybe 2.5 of our 3-hour allotted window. We've not really solved the problem, but we're running out of time. So we sort of wave a wand, all the solutions that the team are coming up with, we sort of give into, and before you know it, we've recovered to business as usual, or at least we're well on the track to that. That's certainly sort of some of the experiences that I've had when facilitating exercises and observing them, and it's something that I'd really like to have a sort of think about today. So what I want to talk about and what I want to discuss is this idea of exercising to failure and introducing failure to our exercises. My background before Plan B Consulting is from the Army, so I did 6 years as an infantry officer, and in that I both participated in a lot of exercises and also towards the end was involved in facilitating them as well. And in that capacity, we spoke a lot about failing, and we spoke a lot about why we should allow our teams going through those exercises to fail at certain times. And it's an attitude that I've brought with me to some extent to Plan B Consulting, but one that needs to be tempered for business. So as I say, it's something that I want to discuss today. And there's four things that I would like to get across today. The first is to have a look at what I mean by exercising to failure. I don't mean that every exercise we do results in catastrophic failure for the team conducting it, but I do want to explore what we could introduce. I want to have a look, secondly, at why we avoid it instinctively, why we don't do it, and why our participants in particular want to avoid it. Thirdly, I'd like to have a think about what we could gain from it. What's the upside and why could we do it in order to build greater resilience? And then finally, I've got some sort of practical steps in terms of how we could introduce it into our exercise programs, and sort of linking into Charlie's discussion recently. Because it is important, if we do it, it's part of a structure and it's not done unilaterally. So without further ado, let's have a look at what I mean and what is this mad idea of failure. If we start with the good practice guidelines, they say quite clearly an organization's continuity capability cannot be considered reliable or effective until it has been exercised. So that's our foundation. That's why we do our exercising in the first place. In terms of this kind of exercising and what I'm really looking at, I think it's important to make it clear, I'm talking about simulated and live exercises, so very much the upper end of the scale. I don't think that when we're talking about planned walkthroughs or tabletop exercises, there's a scope for failure, and I don't think it's helpful, because at that stage we're very much in the walk stage. We're learning the plan, we're learning as a team, so I wouldn't recommend introducing any of these elements at that point. But for your simulated and your live exercises, where you've got a more experienced team and you're doing a more complicated scenario, that's really where I think that we should be focusing. Secondly, I'm talking about an experienced team. I'm not talking about your crisis management team that's just been formed. I'm not talking about your first exercise after you just rolled out business continuity across the organization. This is very much for your experienced crisis management teams that have done these kind of exercises before, have done simulated exercises before, and are maybe looking for more of a challenge. And certainly some of the feedback we get from clients in that area are that they get a bit dull. We're always doing the same scenarios, we're always thinking about the same constructs, and actually we need to break out and introduce new elements to these exercises. And the last bit is a very definite. We're not talking about making a team fail. We're not talking about designing scenarios or building things in that are actively going to make people fail exercises. All we're talking about is allowing the possibility of it. So instead of allowing the team to succeed, instead of sort of pushing them in that direction, it's allowing them to go down rabbit holes or allowing them to go in a direction that could be seen as a failure at the end. That's really what I want to talk about here. So having established those ground rules, I think it's important to think about what failure would look like. There's a couple of ways that I would see failure in an exercise, a couple of team specific ones, and then maybe an individual side of it as well. I think the most obvious example of failure would be a team that's unable to formulate a response to the scenario. The scenario is simply too complex, there's too many elements, and they're unable to address it in the time that they've been given. Now, that would be a fairly significant failure. It would suggest that what you've presented them with is so far outside their remit that they can't formulate a response, or just so overwhelmingly complicated that there's no way to address it. And I think that there are problems with that, and we'll discuss that when we come on to sort of how we build this in. The second way I think a team could fail would be if the response they came up with would probably fail. And I think that we are sometimes quite lenient on teams when we're observing and facilitating exercises. We very much sit on their side. So when they say we would do X, we tend to assume that X would succeed and that they would get away with it, and that would ultimately restore business as usual in line with their recovery time objectives. I think at times we should challenge them on that, and we should assume that actually elements of our response will fail. And we can either do that directly, or we can simply look at what they've done and present them with those at the end and say, actually, you did X, but I think actually Y would happen in these situations for these reasons. And that's another way that we could assess the team as failing in that sense. There's also an individual level of failure, which is a bit more sort of complex and definitely something to avoid if possible. When individuals fail, it's going to have huge ramifications on them and potentially on the team further down the line. With Plan B, when I had these discussions with my colleagues, we came up with some of the exercises that we'd seen. And in terms of individual failure, we've seen team leaders actively hit another participant during an exercise because he chose to start a phone call when the team leader had specifically said not to. And we've also seen a member of a team quit in the middle of an exercise because they were so disgusted with the way that their team were performing. I would strongly suggest that both of those are not good examples of failure, because it's individuals and it suggests that there's something wrong in that team. But again, it is one example of what we might see as failure when we're running our exercises. Now, what I've got for the exercise into failure is an army example that sort of stuck with me. A few years ago, I was training and observing a unit, so about 800 people, that was going through a challenging exercise. It was a 10-day live exercise in Salisbury Plain, so south of England. And essentially, this 800-strong unit is conducting an operation against another army. During the course of this, one of their tasks was to attack an enemy position. So an enemy position had maybe 80 people role-playing the enemy there. They were told to attack it at 11 o'clock at night, and they were told to finish it by 6:30 in the morning. So they had about 7.5 hours to do this. Now, come 6:30 in the morning, they'd failed. The enemy was still on the position, they were not, and yeah, they'd failed to achieve their objective that they'd been set. Now, historically in the army, because of constraints around time and everything else, usually a trainer would wave their magic wands, the enemy would get orders to run away, and the good guys would occupy those positions and we'd move on. Well, what happened in this situation is that the person running the training said no, they have failed and they will have to try again. So it was reset. The good guys went back to where they'd been before, and they had to do it again the next night. Now, this is an example of a team failing to achieve objectives that had been set during an exercise and being held to that failure and being accountable. And we'll pick this up in a second as we move through, because I observed a lot of lessons from this team that had been essentially failed in its exercise. Okay, so we've got exercise into failure. We've got thinking about simulated and live exercises. We've got an experienced team, and we've got not pushing them into it, but allowing them to fail. Why do we avoid it? When I first turned up at Plan B Consulting and started writing exercises, the first thing I was told is that teams cannot fail. And I accepted this at face value. And I still do ensure that we do this whenever we work with clients. But it's something that I've increasingly thought about and challenged both with colleagues and also discussed with clients when the opportunity arose. And I think there's a couple of reasons why we avoid failure instinctively when we're running BC exercises. Firstly, we like to test plans and procedures. We don't like to test people. I think a lot of exercises that we write will have assessed the ability of the CMT to respond to an incident. That's a pretty common objective. It's one that I've written several times. It's one that I've seen written into exercises, but it's very team focused, and very rarely do we drill down into actual individual performance and whether or not they're suitable for the role. And I think that plays slightly into culture. When we talk about, or when we engage with clients and we're talking about crisis management teams, we're often told that we need to be quite sensitive with crisis management teams. We're often dealing with some quite senior people and people who don't want to be pushed outside of their comfort zone. Essentially, people who don't want to fail in front of their colleagues. And that's entirely understandable. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that it's a constraint that we're working with. I think there's also an element of this wouldn't happen in the culture. In order for a team to fail, it probably needs to be quite a complicated scenario, because if it's simple, they'll knock it out of the park 9 times out of 10. And the closer we get to those complicated scenarios and the more complexity we introduce, the more likely we are to run up into that this wouldn't happen kind of territory. And that's a very difficult territory to get back out of. Especially if we're putting people's backs up against the wall, if we're putting teams under pressure and individuals under pressure, it's often natural recourse is just to say this wouldn't happen, to turn off from the exercise and not to engage with it anymore. So that's the cultural side of things, and that's one of the reasons that we I think we instinctively shy away from pushing teams in this direction. In terms of people, we need to be really aware of what failure does to people if we were to sort of force it. When people fail, they perceive the goal as further away. So it makes it seem like success was unachievable. And as that wouldn't happen kind of tertiary again, but if a team fails, then they think that they would never gear to succeed. And that's again challenging to get people out of that mindset. It also makes people feel less able and can damage people's sort of feeling of self-worth and psychological well-being there. And it can create or reinforce a further fear of failure. So if we have failure once, we're scared to try again, we may not turn back up for the next exercise. So that's the people side of things, or some of the reasons around why people cause us to avoid introducing failure. And the final sort of reason I've picked out is the business side of things. Ultimately, your crisis management team may not turn up again if they're caused to fail, if they don't want to be put under that pressure again. If you only have one day a year with a team, do you really want to have failure as your outcome from that exercise? Probably not. You want to leave them on a high note. You want to leave them with success. So that's again a reason why we would avoid it. If you're bringing in external consultants, that's expensive. You're spending a fair amount of money on a large simulated or live exercise. Why would you want failure to be the outcome of that? All those sort of tie into the business side of why we wouldn't want to introduce failure and why we instinctively avoid it. And it all comes back to that idea of if the crisis management team, if the sponsor is going to sign off on it, they see the exercise as a set piece that they need to do once a year. Why would they want that one set piece to be the team failing in its outcome? I think when I again spoke to colleagues, looked at examples of teams failing. One of the ones we picked out was an oil and gas company going through an exercise every 3 years in order to validate its response procedures, in order to make sure it could respond to something along the lines of Deepwater Horizon. They went through their preparation for this big test exercise. One of my colleagues was facilitating, and they failed. They had an overcomplicated response procedure. They never got round to actually responding to the incident because they were too caught up in procedures and going through the right boxes. It turned out to be quite vitriolic by the end. They turned on some of the facilitators, and there was an overall bad atmosphere that was left from that. And that's not a nice place to leave that. That's not a good way to leave an exercise. But again, the sort of positive side of that, they identified that they needed to reform their systems. They brought in experts to do that, and they ended up passing the actual assessment. So they failed the practice assessment, but passed the actual assessment. So again, by failing the practice, they identified areas for improvement, and they did ultimately succeed. To go back to my military example, the unit that just failed, as an observer, I was working very closely with them. I was assessing them in areas, and all I saw was a sort of crushing morale blow. I saw a lot of junior soldiers and staff despondent, and I saw a lot of internal fighting. I saw a lot of people blaming each other for the failure. Morale was at a very low ebb, and it was very difficult to see a team picking itself back up again. So to say, if you're looking for reasons to avoid it, we're right there. Teams start infighting, and the morale blow of failing something that of this magnitude can be crushing. So that's why I think we instinctively avoid it. But I think there are benefits. I think there are elements that we could gain from it. When I was researching for this webinar, one of the articles I read, one of the quotes that stays with me, says, perhaps it is therefore fair to argue that those who do not permit failure in training of fostering an environment of only limited success. And that has stuck with me, because I think there is an element that if we're not fully prepared to go the distance, then we may not fully get the benefits from what we're doing. So there's 3 areas that I think that we should be looking for our gains from pushing teams to these levels. The first is experience. Now, again, as a former army officer, I went through a lot of very challenging training, but one of the things that teaches you and gives you is that bank of I've dealt with worse. And I think that if we don't make training as difficult as actually dealing with a crisis would be, then we're in danger of underselling our team's ability to respond, or rather overselling. We're in danger of not giving them that experience to fall back on. So by making training challenging, we're giving them the experience that when the worst comes to the worst and they're faced with a real crisis, they can fall back on it and know that they've worked effectively as a team in the past and know that they've solved challenging problems, as opposed to just responded to the building being burnt down every year, which forms some annual assessments. When we stretch executives who are sometimes not stretched in other ways, we're going to give them more tools to enhance their leadership as well. And it will benefit the organization if they're continually tested in this way and continually built. So that's where the experience, I think, is vital. It allows us to really build up our teams, and it allows us to give them that bank in order to respond effectively. On the trust side of things, it allows teams to bond more effectively. And it relies on having that experienced team, and a lot of the time it relies on having the same team in each time. But ultimately, if we can build that trust, then that's only going to be a positive thing for the teams. And it also allows probably our employees to trust our leadership team more if they know that they're being put under pressure in these scenarios. Organizational understanding. It will force teams, leaders of these teams, executives, whoever they are, to understand the people on their teams. It will force them to understand who they've got, their capabilities, what they're good at, what they're bad at, and ultimately whether or not they're suitable to be on that team in the face of a real crisis. Again, reinforcing that trust element. If we're stretching them with complex scenarios, it's also going to allow them to more fully appreciate the impact a crisis is going to have. And it's going to force them to respond more realistically in many ways and give them a better understanding of their organizational capabilities, especially if we're challenging them on some of their solutions when appropriate. And finally, if we're stretching them beyond the limits of their existing plans and people, then we understand where those limits are and ultimately where we're going to have to improvise, and whether or not we are prepared to do that. So I think there's a lot to be said for taking the limits of plans and people to some extent and pushing them beyond those in appropriate scenarios. When I think back to the military example, come lunchtime on the day after the sort of the big failure, as it were, again, I was walking around the unit, discussing with various people, and what I saw was the effect of effective senior leadership at that point. I saw a senior leadership team take control, I saw them give clear direction, and I saw them start to rebuild trust as well. They were able to galvanize the team through good leadership and through a shared sort of experience of failure there. And because of that, they were able to build that team back up better than it had been before, and they succeeded the next night in taking that objective and ultimately succeeding. And I think that when we then went and spoke to them the next day, and when we did the debrief, certainly, there was a strong element of learning from that failure and a really sort of strong unit cohesion that was built out of it. And I think it's something that could be replicated in a crisis management team, is harnessing that failure as a positive experience. But I think in order to do it, we need to structure it. And that's what I'd like to spend the last bit of this webinar looking at, is sort of some practical steps in order to build this in a way that's not going to be detrimental to the team. So I've got 5 steps, and I'm going to split them out slightly. The first, and very importantly, is starting slow. Is that don't walk before we run, and don't fail before we succeed. As I said at the beginning, I'm talking about experienced teams, and I'm talking about complicated exercises. We need to give participants all the tools that we possibly can before they enter this arena. So they need to be trained and need to be experienced in their role. We definitely build up to this because what we don't want them to do is feel like they have been set up to fail through lack of experience or lack of training. So that starting slow is crucial. Get buy-in. This is absolutely vital. Participants need to be aware that it's an option to some extent. You certainly need to have the sponsors buy-in, so the BC sponsor, whoever's sponsoring the exercise, and I suggest that also whoever the senior person, the team leader is also aware that or has agreed that this is an outcome. Because if we don't have that, we're going to get that element of disconnect, and we're potentially going to have teams that won't want to come back and do more exercises, or that will just not participate and start dropping out. So we need to get that buy-in, and it needs to be sold as an opportunity. We are going to test teams further in order to get better results in the long run. That's one of the ways that we could achieve buy-in. But I also understand that buy-in is not achievable for everyone. Thirdly, and linked to that, is avoiding unrealistic scenarios. I think that instinctively, if we want to make things more complicated and if we want to make things more difficult, then we're going to leap to the furthest possible point on that scale. And we're going to have to make more things happen at once. We're going to have to cause all kinds of strange coincidences that all happen on the same day in order to really stretch the crisis management team. And I think that, as with all exercises, we just need to be very careful with how we structure that. And we need to make sure that they remain grounded in an element of realism. There are ways of testing teams further without avoiding unrealistic scenarios, although I think unrealistic might be redefined by what we're living through at the moment. But some of those Grace 1 events, some of those really high impact, sort of lower likelihood events could be used as long as they're grounded in a risk register or in a horizon scan that's been done. There are other ways of putting teams under more pressure. We have one client that we work with where they have a very significant single point of failure in the room. They've got one member of the team who knows everything backwards and forwards and is absolutely critical to any response. If you remove that person, that is essentially setting that team up for a much more challenging scenario. So that's another way of introducing difficult elements, is if you remove people or equipment or other key crutches that could realistically not be there on the day of the response. Number 4, debrief. This becomes very important. We always do a debrief, or we should always do a debrief at the end of the exercise. And this can vary in how long we give to it, depending on how much time are these executives given us to have at the end, essentially. In a 4-hour exercise, if it's run on a bit, then we may only get 10 minutes to scribble some thoughts on a whiteboard before people have to leave. I think if teams have performed badly, the debrief becomes absolutely critical in order to reorientate them. And it's vital that we identify where things went badly and what elements didn't go well, and that we actively agree how we're going to address those there and then. We get the buy-in, and we look at how we're going to learn those lessons and how we're going to adopt them in the future. That's what we need to pull out of the debrief, is an action plan against what went badly. that can't be done in 10 minutes. So it needs to be given appropriate time in order to make sure that we get the most out of that. And the final bit, run another exercise. Easier said than done. With my army example that I've gone through there, we're very fortunate in the sense that we've got them for 10 days. They failed on day 4. They can redo it on day 5. It's seamless. They just go straight back through it. And that's the best way of doing it because it gets them back on their feet, back into it, and are able to take on the points of the debrief very, very quickly. Again, for crisis management teams, we may not achieve this. So it really, there's a couple of ways of organizing it. Either within the 4-hour period, we're looking to give them another exercise at the end, if possible. Or if we've got a day with them, then brilliant. We can do one in the morning, have a debrief at lunchtime, and then run another one in the afternoon. Or we need to have one scheduled in for the not too distant future. Because what we can't really have is a team that's done badly in June and doesn't do another exercise until the next June, because it doesn't allow them to learn those lessons. By the time they come back into that room, a whole other year's gone and they've reset back to 0 again. So tying into what Charlie's been talking about in his exercise programs, it needs to be structured so that if we're going to present them with a challenging scenario that we think they may perform badly in, we've got the ability to build them back up again and give them a scenario that they're going to succeed in not too long after that, in order to allow us to really get the benefits from it. Okay, I think I've probably spoken just about long enough. What I wanted to do was address the idea of failure, address the idea of teams performing badly in an exercise. I wanted to really get to grips with why we avoid it. So what we've discussed is why, or rather what exercise into failure looks like. We've discussed the fact that we're going to use experienced teams and the fact that we're going to look at simulated and live exercises. And we've discussed some of the ways that failure can appear. So whether that be teams unable to respond to scenarios, or teams formulating perhaps bad responses, or indeed at an individual level. We've discussed why we avoid it. We've looked at culture, we've looked at people, and we've looked at business reasons why we instinctively avoid failing. And there are a long list of them, and a lot of them are very justified. We don't have the time for people to be failing. People, the participants, don't want to fail. They don't want to look bad in front of their colleagues. And exercises are expensive, and we're not going to run them to an unsuccessful conclusion. But what we then looked at was the upsides, and we looked at the experience that teams will gain from it and the trust that they build in their units to actually respond better in the future. And that idea that if we build a bank of challenging exercises, that when we come to respond to a crisis, we'll respond more effectively as a team. And the final bit we've just looked at there is some practical steps of how to build it into an exercise program. So starting slow, getting buy-in, avoiding unrealistic scenarios, making sure we debrief thoroughly, and then running another exercise as close to the event as we possibly can. So thanks very much for your time this morning. I think we're now going to take some questions. Okay, so got a question asking if the type of exercise makes any difference in whether it's more likely to succeed or fail. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think instinctively the type in itself shouldn't make a difference. Sometimes how we set them up will cause either frustrations or benefits. So with a simulated exercise, where we've got role players perhaps injecting from other cells, we've perhaps got more ability to influence the outcome. We've got the ability to control those injects in a way that guides the team down certain paths. And we've also got the ability to say no to the team, so that if they're asking for resources, or if they're asking role players to do tasks for them, we've got the ability to control those outcomes as well, to guide them towards a certain outcome. With a live exercise, I think instinctively they're going to probably have to be more structured, because we're going to have more moving parts. We're going to have perhaps more disruption across the business as well in order to facilitate it. And we possibly don't want to make up or to change things quite as dynamically as we can with a simulated exercise. But I don't think that the type of exercise in itself is going to dictate whether it's going to succeed or fail. But thank you for the question.
I'm just wondering, I think that's the only question that we're going to answer today. So let's just give people a couple of seconds if there's any more questions. Otherwise, we will just say, yeah, no, I think that's our questions done. So I'd just like to say thank you. Great session, Andrew. Thank you very much for that. I enjoyed that. Learned some more, which is always good. And thank you for everyone else that came and listened in. As I mentioned earlier, you'll receive a recording of the webinar later on today. This will be emailed to you via GoToWebinar. All previous webinar recordings are also available via our website. Our next webinar, Organising Your Response Plan, is on Friday at 10 AM British Summer Time, and will be presented by Gillian Logie, also a senior consultant at Plan B Consulting. Further information on all upcoming webinars can be found on our website. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.